What would you do if a simple argument over rent suddenly turned into a nightmare that ended 2 lives? Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications if you enjoy deep, suspense-driven true crime stories that uncover the chilling reality behind real cases. These stories matter, and every detail helps us understand how ordinary moments can spiral into tragedy. It was a quiet afternoon in Wilson, North Carolina. The kind of afternoon where nothing feels unusual. Sunlight hung high above the neighborhood. Cars passed slowly. Neighbors carried on with their routines. On Washington Street, everything appeared normal. But inside one home, tension had already begun to build. What started as a dispute about unpaid rent had been simmering for weeks. Conversations had grown shorter. Voices sharper. And on that September afternoon in 2025, the confrontation would finally reach a breaking point. Neighbors would later remember hearing raised voices first. Then a pause. Then the sound that would shatter the calm of the entire street. Gunshots. Within minutes, sirens tore through the quiet neighborhood as emergency responders rushed to the scene. A mother lay fatally wounded. Her son collapsed nearby. Another victim fought for life. And the man accused of pulling the trigger was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was someone the community believed they knew. Someone who had built a reputation around leadership, public service, and standing against violence. So how does a dispute over rent spiral into a deadly confrontation? What happened in those final moments before the gunfire? And how did a man trusted by his community become the center of one of the most shocking crimes the town had ever seen? Stay with us as we uncover the chilling chain of events behind a case that left a family shattered, a community stunned, and a question that still lingers today. If you're new here and you want more gripping true crime documentaries that reveal the darkest truths behind real stories, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share your thoughts below as we begin this disturbing case. Fog rolled quietly through the streets of Wilson, North Carolina, drifting under streetlights that hummed in the late-night silence. From above, the town looked peaceful. Small houses. Empty sidewalks. Porch lights glowing faintly in the darkness. Nothing about the scene suggested that, only weeks earlier, one of those quiet homes had become the center of a nightmare. On the afternoon of September 14, 2025, life on Washington Street moved slowly, like any other day. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Cars passed occasionally. Neighbors watered lawns or sat on front porches, escaping the late summer heat. Then came the sound that shattered everything. Gunfire. Short. Violent. Final. One neighbor later told investigators the sound froze him in place. 3, maybe 4 shots, he said quietly. Then somebody screaming. Within minutes, the calm neighborhood turned into a scene of panic. A woman ran into the street clutching her phone. Call 911. Somebody's been shot. Sirens began wailing across Wilson as police cars and ambulances raced toward Washington Street. But the story that led to those gunshots had begun long before that moment. It began with a house, and a dispute over rent. Inside that house lived 44-year-old Natasha Sutton and her 21-year-old son, Avanti Pender. To neighbors, they were just another family trying to get by. But outside, walking toward the property that afternoon, was a man who believed he had been pushed too far. Dante Maurice Chestnut. A landlord. A community figure. A man known for preaching against violence. And in just a few moments, his name would become tied to one of the most shocking crimes the town of Wilson had ever seen. Because the conversation that was about to happen on that quiet front porch would not end in words. In one picture, Natasha Latrice Sutton stands in the middle of a family gathering, smiling wide, her arms wrapped around relatives who lean into her like she's the center of gravity. In another, she sits at a kitchen table laughing at something someone just said. The kind of laugh that fills a room. To the people who knew her in Wilson, North Carolina, Natasha was that kind of person. 44 years old. A mother first, everything else second. Neighbors often saw her outside in the afternoons, sitting on the porch steps or talking with people passing by. She always spoke, one neighbor would later recall. Didn't matter who you were. Natasha would say hello. But behind the smiles and the conversations, life was not easy. Bills stacked up the way they do for so many families trying to stay afloat. Rent, groceries, utilities. Every month felt like a quiet race against the calendar. Still, Natasha kept pushing forward. Because inside that house on Washington Street lived the person she cared about most. Her son, Avanti Pender. At 21, Avanti stood at that fragile edge between youth and adulthood. Tall, soft-spoken, with a calm presence that friends described as steady and thoughtful. In one photograph, he stands in a graduation gown, smiling shyly for the camera. In another, he's younger, maybe 10 years old, holding a basketball nearly as big as his torso. People who knew him say he wasn't loud or reckless. He kept to himself most days. He was a good kid, a friend would later say quietly. Just trying to figure life out like the rest of us. Most afternoons, Avanti stayed close to home. Sometimes he helped his mother around the house. Sometimes he just sat on the porch, watching the street. Washington Street moved slowly. Children rode bicycles up and down the sidewalks. Cars passed every few minutes. Neighbors waved from their yards. From the outside, nothing about the Sutton household looked unusual. But tension had been growing in the background. A problem that had nothing to do with family, and everything to do with money. Rent. Like so many households across the country, Natasha had fallen behind. The pressure had been building quietly, week after week. Phone calls. Reminders. Conversations that grew a little sharper each time they happened. Inside the home, Natasha tried to keep the stress away from her son. "We'll figure it out," she once told him softly while standing in the kitchen, folding a stack of laundry. Avanti leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, even if she wasn't completely certain. "That's what we do," she said. "We figure it out." But outside the walls of that house, patience was running thin. And somewhere in Wilson, a man was preparing to confront them about the debt he believed they owed. Back inside the house, the day of September 14, 2025, unfolded like any other. Sunlight pushed through the living room windows. The television murmured quietly in the background. Avanti walked through the hallway of the small home he had grown up in, passing a bedroom that still carried pieces of his childhood. Old posters. A worn dresser. Memories that had never quite been packed away. Hours later, that same hallway would fall silent forever. Because before the sun set that evening, something would happen on Washington Street that would turn an ordinary financial dispute into a crime scene. And when the police arrived, the photographs of Natasha Sutton and her son would become something else entirely. Evidence of lives that had suddenly, and violently, come to an end. 5 minutes into the story, the focus shifts. Because every tragedy has two sides. The lives that were lost, and the person who would later stand accused of taking them. In Wilson, North Carolina, many people already knew the man connected to the house on Washington Street. His face had appeared in local photographs long before police ever released his mugshot. In one picture, he stands beside a group of teenagers at a community event, smiling confidently while speaking into a microphone. In another, he's shaking hands with residents at a neighborhood gathering. To many people, he looked like a man trying to improve his city. A community organizer. A non-profit founder. Someone who spoke often about guiding young people away from crime and violence. At one youth event, he once told a small crowd gathered inside a local recreation center, "Our kids deserve better choices than the streets. If we don't lead them, somebody else will." People clapped. Some nodded in agreement. He carried himself like someone with a mission. In 2023, that mission grew bigger. Local newspapers ran short articles announcing his campaign for a seat on the city council. In campaign photos, he wore a pressed shirt and stood confidently against a backdrop of American flags and community banners. His message sounded familiar to voters. Stronger neighborhoods. Youth programs. Ending cycles of violence. One resident who attended a town meeting remembered shaking his hand afterward. He seemed like a good man, the resident later told reporters. Someone who cared. But public images can be deceiving. Behind the speeches and handshakes, the man also lived another role, one far less visible to the community. He was a landlord. And one of the properties tied to his name sat quietly on Washington Street. Inside that house lived a mother and son struggling to stay afloat. For weeks, tension had been growing between them. Rent payments were late. Phone calls went unanswered. Conversations that once stayed polite slowly began to carry sharper edges. One afternoon, according to people familiar with the situation, the landlord placed another call. The phone rang inside the small house. The young man glanced at the screen. "It's him again," he said quietly. His mother sighed from the other side of the room. "Just let it ring." The phone stopped. But the silence that followed felt heavier than the call itself. Outside that home, frustration was building. For a landlord trying to collect payments, every missed deadline could feel like a personal challenge. A sign of disrespect. And somewhere in Wilson, patience was beginning to wear thin. Neighbors would later say the situation had grown tense long before the day of the shooting. One person recalled hearing raised voices during a previous visit. Another remembered seeing a man standing outside the house speaking firmly to someone inside. Nothing violent. Just tension. But sometimes tension is where everything begins. On the morning of September 14th, the man woke up like any other Sunday. The sun was already rising over Wilson, casting long shadows across quiet streets. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang in the distance. For most people in the neighborhood, it would be a normal afternoon. Errands. Football games on television. Families gathering for dinner. But for the man connected to the Washington Street property, something was shifting. Investigators would later piece together the timeline slowly. Phone records. Witness statements. Fragments of conversations. Sometime early that afternoon, he decided to go to the house. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the belief that the situation needed to be handled face to face. Whatever the reason, he got into his vehicle and began driving across Wilson. Traffic lights changed quietly along the way. Cars passed in the opposite lane. Nobody on the road had any idea where he was heading, or what would happen when he arrived. Back on Washington Street, the house sat in the same afternoon calm it always had. Inside, the television murmured softly. Outside, the street remained peaceful. Until a car slowly pulled up to the curb. The engine stopped. A door opened. Footsteps approached the house. And somewhere behind that front door, a confrontation was about to begin, one that would turn a man known for speaking against violence into the center of a deadly one. But neighbors standing nearby swore they sensed something different that day. A crack in normalcy. A tension that didn't belong in Washington Street. He reached the porch, paused, then knocked. Words followed, harsh, clipped, rising in pitch. The afternoon sun hung high over Washington Street, casting long, sharp shadows across the quiet neighborhood. The usual sounds of suburban life, distant lawnmowers, children playing, a dog barking, faded as the tension built on that small porch. Every step, every breath, felt heavier than normal, as if the world was holding its own breath. The man approached the front door slowly, his shadow stretching across the walkway, hands clenched, face hard and unreadable. Inside, the mother and her son sensed the rising danger, though neither fully understood what was about to happen. "Just stay calm," she whispered to him, her voice trembling. "We can handle this." He nodded, eyes darting toward the door, heart pounding in the still air. The porch creaked under a careful footstep. There was no warning beyond the sudden knock, sharp and urgent, that echoed through the house. Voices rose. Words were exchanged, sharp, clipped, tense. But tension alone could not have prepared anyone for what came next. At approximately 2 p.m., gunfire ripped through the quiet street. The first shot cracked like lightning, startling birds into the sky. The second followed almost immediately, and then another. Inside, chaos erupted. Furniture toppled, a lamp shattered, the mother's hands flew to cover her son. The young man stumbled back, trying to shield himself. The mother reached out, trying to pull him down, and in that instant, they were both struck. The third person in the home, a distant relative who had arrived earlier, fell to the floor, critically wounded. Outside, neighbors screamed and ran for cover. Some ducked behind parked cars, some called 911 on shaking hands. The street, once calm and sunlit, was now a scene of horror. Within minutes, police cars and ambulances arrived, sirens cutting through the thick afternoon air. Officers rushed onto the porch, weapons drawn, hearts hammering with adrenaline. Crime scene tape was unfurled, blocking off the street. Flashing red and blue lights painted the nearby houses in urgent, chaotic strokes. Paramedics worked quickly, but the mother and her son were already gone. Their lives ended in minutes, erased in a series of gunshots that would echo in the community for months. The third victim was rushed to a hospital, fighting for survival. When investigators later photographed the scene, the house looked silent and empty. Windows dark. The front door slightly ajar. The normal warmth of a home replaced with the still, haunting absence of life. Neighbors who had waved and nodded at the family just hours before now stood in disbelief, clutching each other, whispering fragments of "why" and "how could this happen?" The ordinary rhythm of the street had been violently shattered. For the families, the loss was total. No more birthdays. No more graduations. No more laughter echoing through those walls. No more morning conversations, no more quiet evenings on the porch. Only absence. The shooting left a scar not just on Washington Street but on the minds of those who witnessed it. Children who had played on the sidewalks that morning would never see the neighborhood the same way again. Adults who had greeted the family with friendly waves now walked past with a hollow silence, haunted by the memory of that sudden eruption of violence. And somewhere nearby, the man who had carried the gun stood, the weight of his actions slowly settling in, though the streets around him remained eerily calm. The echoes of gunfire would linger long after the sun set, marking a day that no one in Wilson, North Carolina, would ever forget. A quiet street. A small house. Lives taken in minutes. And a community left to grapple with the shock of a tragedy that had come, so suddenly, to a place that had once seemed safe. The man who had approached the house just hours earlier was no longer a figure walking down a quiet street. Within hours, police had traced him, identified him, and moved quickly. A mugshot captured him now, face blank, expression unreadable, hands pulled into the cold metal of handcuffs that clicked shut with finality. In Wilson, the news spread like wildfire. Residents who had waved, shaken hands, and nodded at him in neighborhood gatherings felt a chill run through their memories. The man who had preached guidance, community support, and anti-violence had become the town's most wanted suspect. "Can you believe it?" a neighbor whispered into a phone, voice trembling. "He seemed normal. He seemed good." But investigators had pieced together a different reality. Calls, witness statements, and social media footage all pointed to him. The calm exterior was a mask. The quiet man who had once stood behind podiums at community events now faced the full weight of the law. A split screen captured the stark contrast. On one side, him smiling at a youth mentorship program, shaking hands with teenagers and adults, campaign banners behind him. On the other, the same man in custody, hair slightly disheveled, eyes avoiding the camera, handcuffs chaining his wrists. The illusion of public goodwill shattered in an instant. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Additional charges followed for the critically wounded survivor, whose life now hung in delicate balance. Prosecutors described the attack as swift, deliberate, and tragically final. Outside the courthouse, journalists crowded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Reporters shouted questions. How could someone so respected commit this? Defense attorneys moved quickly, arguments murmured in hallways, motions filed, strategies discussed behind closed doors. But for those who had lost everything, the legal maneuvering was meaningless. They had no chance to say goodbye. No time to prevent the violence that had shattered their lives. Bond was denied. His future was sealed behind bars, and he was led down a corridor to a holding cell. Each step echoed through the courthouse, a hollow rhythm marking the gravity of his fall from public grace. Neighbors and friends stood in disbelief outside, murmuring fragments of disbelief and fear. How could someone so familiar become so alien in just hours? How could a figure of community hope turn into a symbol of horror? For the mother and son, justice had arrived too late. Their lives could never be restored, no matter the severity of the charges. Photos of them at home, smiling, frozen in time, reminded the town of what had been lost. Inside, investigators continued their work, piecing together the timeline, the interactions, the final minutes before the shooting. Every detail mattered. Every witness statement added weight to a narrative that would soon be presented in court. Outside, the streets returned slowly to normal, children on bikes, neighbors walking dogs, the hum of life trying to reclaim its rhythm. Yet, beneath that ordinary veneer, the memory of a bright afternoon turned deadly lingered. The quiet man with a public face now sat behind bars, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that in a single instant, trust can shatter completely. The town of Wilson would remember that day, a day when normalcy was ripped away, when 2 lives were taken, and when the face of a trusted neighbor became forever entwined with tragedy. The street was quiet now, bathed in the orange glow of a setting sun. Shadows stretched across the sidewalks, tracing the outlines of houses that once felt safe. On the lawn of the small home, neighbors left flowers, candles flickering in the gentle evening breeze, a silent tribute to lives lost too soon. People whispered as they placed their tokens of remembrance. Some knelt, others stood with hands clasped, eyes fixed on the growing memorial. I can't understand it, one neighbor murmured, voice barely above the wind. He always talked about keeping kids off the streets, about ending violence. And then, this. Another shook her head, folding a note into the flowers. We all thought he was helping. We didn't see this coming until it was too late. Inside the town, conversations carried the same tremor of disbelief. In living rooms, workplaces, even at the grocery store, people asked the same question: how could someone so trusted, so publicly devoted to preventing harm, become the cause of it? At a small vigil, a teenager clutched a candle tightly, tears streaming down his face. I played basketball with his programs, he whispered. I thought he cared. I thought we were safe. The pain was a tangible thing, hanging over the street like the thick summer air. Some spoke of warning signs they had ignored, or noticed too late, others of nothing at all, only the shock of an ordinary day turned unthinkable. Police continued their work quietly behind closed doors, collecting statements, examining evidence, reconstructing moments that no one could erase. But outside the house, in the streets and homes of Wilson, grief had no such boundaries. Neighbors lit candles one by one, each flame a heartbeat in memory of the mother and her son. Words of sorrow and disbelief drifted through the evening air. A mother walked slowly past the porch where the shooting had occurred, her eyes downcast, clutching her child's hand. We'll never forget them, she said, voice cracking, as the wind carried it down the street. The community had changed in the span of hours, a quiet neighborhood now marked by tragedy. Each shadow, each corner, reminded residents of a trust broken, of a life that could not be reclaimed. Questions remained unanswered, but the weight of loss was unmistakable. For those who lived there, the memory of that bright afternoon, laughter interrupted, a young life and a mother gone, would linger, unrelenting, a testament to how quickly peace could unravel into violence. Wilson, once ordinary, had become a place where grief and disbelief intertwined, leaving a scar that would not fade with the passing of time. The street was silent, the sun dipping behind rooftops, casting long, empty shadows across Washington Street. No cars passed. No voices broke the calm. Only the faint rustle of leaves whispered through the neighborhood. A figure paused at the corner, staring at the house that had once held life and laughter. The memories hung heavy, impossible to shake. A conversation from weeks before replayed in the mind. "We'll pay, we just need time," the young man had said, desperation in his voice. "Time isn't always enough," came the reply, firm, final. That day, it hadn't been enough. In minutes, 2 lives were erased, a third left to heal in pieces, and an entire community plunged into grief and disbelief. Friends, neighbors, strangers, all grappling with the same question: how could a dispute so ordinary end in horror? The street now held only absence. Flowers wilted. Candles burned low. The ordinary rhythm of life had been shattered forever. A single note of silence lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. Names etched into memory: the mother, the son. When ordinary men are pushed too far, the line between responsibility and tragedy blurs. And sometimes, in that moment, nothing can bring back what was lost.